Basically, we're getting together to talk about how we're looking at taking the macroeconomic factors, how we look at planning our business from a CFO standpoint, how we look at managing our costs from a CIO or IT standpoint, and how, in I would say uncertain times, we're trying to take out uncertainty, manage risk, but put the flexibility into our planning process or our operational process, and bring you guys together to talk about how you look at it from a market standpoint, how you try to plan for 2023 and beyond, and trying to drive in basically into the cloud itself as a very, I would say, useful, amazing tool in many cases, but also can be a little unpredictable.
I'll just give one perspective from an operator as a chief financial officer. I'll also give you a slightly different perspective as a board member of a public company. Because in both situations, we're being impacted by, to your point, the uncertainty of rising costs, and it's compounded by the idea that it's no longer growth at all costs. Growth has now been put a couple of rungs below in favor of profitability. And profitability is defined whether or not it's gross margin, gross profit profitability, all the way down to bottom line profitability. In the past, we had the luxury that because things were growing, we didn't really care how. It was just, you're growing. And the feedback from either private investors or public investors was, great, you're doing what I'm asking you to do. And for those more mature companies, they grew a bit slower, law of large numbers. And so they kind of knew what to expect. But for the ones that were growing faster and maybe losing a lot of money, the losing a lot of money versus a little bit of money, it didn't matter. It was you're growing.
Right.
And as soon as the market uncertainty, whether it was generated geopolitically, that's what compounded in supply chain, that then compounded into interest rates, that upended things in a very, very fast fashion, because some of the stuff, as we just mentioned, is drives revenue. Some of it does not.
Right.
I'll use a very simple example. The more analysis I do doesn't necessarily drive more revenue.
That's right.
It may make better decisions that will imply future revenue, but do I do the analysis 5 times? Or can I get away with 2 times? And if it's going to drive 3x more cost, I may say, you know what, I'm going to live with only 2 times of reviewing said analysis. But I have to live with this cloud infrastructure today that I know immediately as I get more customers, my costs go up. That I can rationalize.
Right. Honestly, we've been playing in easy mode for the past few years, where the cost of capital was near zero. There's the income statement version of how does that IT affect your actual revenue and bottom line. And then there's also a balance sheet version of what does technology actually do for your actual valuation, and how is it seen as an asset?
I'd say, sort of riffing on that a little bit, which is investors or stakeholders, because of the rise in interest rates, no longer have patience. It's, I can't wait 5 years for the return on that particular investment. I need to know, I need to see it, and I see it within a reasonable period of time, a year, months, if you will. I need that money today. I can't wait for that dollar, because that dollar is depreciating at a faster rate than it was 6 months ago.
On the analyst side, we I would say across the board, still think IT spend is going to go up about 5% next year, but a lot of that has to be based on productivity.
Also, to that point of sort of that productivity, if you can actually draw a line that this service, this software, this whatever, if that can drive more productivity from the folks that you currently have, I want that. I think from my perspective, both as an operator and as a board member, it's like sustained revenue growth at a sort of an acceptable profitability. But it's sustained, and that's the part that it's the predictability.
So operational efficiency definitely matters. It's not grow at all costs, and the hard part is those indirect expenses you make to try to either place new bets or do more analysis become harder to justify, right? When you're kind of paying $1 for every question you ask. I'm the kind of guy who likes ask a lot of questions, and then you see that kind of rack up. That makes it tougher.
The speed of getting the data to make the decision is just hypercritical.
Yeah.
But then that's where the cost of, how much does it cost you to get that speed? And
that's right.
Lots of iteration.
The idea that 3 years ago we thought about annual planning and
geez.
budgeting cycles, like that seems like an eternity ago. Like that just does not happen anymore. If you have the luxury of doing that, like you're running some sort of incredible magic business.
You might be shrinking.
Yep.
You might be losing a whole section of your business. Everything's on the table. And that's just a very different motion for not only myself, but for boards, for executive team members who've only known, and I'll use the last decade as maybe a reasonable time period, they've only known up and to the right. And so there's this like, wait a minute, that doesn't happen?
That's right.
There are generations that we're sort of interacting with that have never seen this before.
Right.
And so I think, given where we were 12 months ago, when folks weren't really worried about costs, it's just been such a 180.
Yeah.
Where it's like, now not only am I worried about costs, but I need to know it this quarter after that.
When you think of IT cost management, it is easy to just call that an accounting exercise and leave it at that. But the reality is that IT cost management and that expense lifecycle is really a team sport, where you've got IT involved, both perhaps on the general IT side as well as specific developers. You often have sourcing and procurement involved. You have some level of finance involved, perhaps somebody from tax involved, perhaps somebody from legal involved, even perhaps security, governance. At Amalgam Insights, my research firm, we talk about the IT rule of 30, which basically says that any IT category that has gone unmanaged for a while typically has 30% of waste in it, just because people buy stuff and forget to turn it off.
It reminds me a little bit of, I've got young children, and I'll say like, hey, I want another stuffed toy. I'm like, well, how many do you have? Well, let's go take a look. And you go upstairs and you see this army of dolls. Like, when's the last time you used any of this? Oh, I don't remember. Can we throw this one away? Oh, no, that's really important. Can't do that one. And so. Right,
because if you're looking from a pure accounting perspective, I know a great way to cut 100% of your IT costs. Just turn everything off. How well is that going to work for you? I don't know, but hey, that takes care of your cost structure problem. You might have some other business problems as a result. Yeah, I'm just curious as a CFO, where does tech fall into your list of priorities? Because you've got to deal with headcount, real estate, all these other things that make a business a business.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's they're all important, is what I would say.
Sure.
And so I'd say, I think about headcount as it equates to me long-term value. That most of the folks that we have in our organization are software folks. They're coding long-term value that ultimately can pass on to our customer, and that should have some sort of sustained value. The question is when I'm making priority choices, can I use software or services to augment their productivity? In Q2 of 2022 was sort of peak uncertainty.
Yep.
I liken it to if anyone ever has younger children or grandchildren, if you've seen Moana, and when Maui jumps into the volcano and he's still falling, he's like, I'm still falling. Investors were feeling that all in Q2. And so they didn't want to hear about any investment opportunities. They were like, I'm just looking for a bottom, something that I can begin to predict.
The past couple of years, cloud, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service have gone up 25+% per year. And you almost have to write that into the OPEX model if you're going pure cloud, because that's just what happens in reality. If you just put a kind of a straight, consistent cost of OPEX for over a 3-year period for an ROI project, you're probably gonna mess up your cost structure because that's just not reality.
The question is, if I'm a cloud vendor or someone who's sort of pitching a company, am I pitching, the head of technology with this sort of nuance, or am I pitching the CFO?
Right.
The CFO probably doesn't know enough of the technology to appreciate the technology trade-off, but neither does the head of the operation or the head of the technology decision have enough understanding to appreciate the financial trade-off.
Yeah, and in good times that's great because as as long as your cloud growth is aligned to your revenue and your revenue keeps going up, sure, you keep growing that cloud cost all you want, because it's basically a cost of goods sold, cost of doing business, and you can make an argument for it. But then when you lock yourself into a 3-year contract that assumes that you have to hit a certain level, and now this happens, and your business might be down 20% this quarter.
No, that makes sense. And in fact, we have one of our customers I was talking to a couple of weeks ago was talking about the ability to use cloud and have flexibility to go into a new market with a new product. See a couple of customers adopt that. On demand works really well for that. And then as he onboards, say 5 to 10 customers, they then think about, well, why don't we move to a more subscription?
Ultimately, it comes down to that predictability, which is why predictability is so important in this example or in this discussion, because if today we're no longer being rewarded as we used to for, I'm just going to use an example, 10% growth.
Right.
Now they're like, great, if you grow 8%, but you drive the bottom line a little bit faster, I will reward you more so, or at least relative to others. Versus someone might be like, hey, I can grow 15%, and I would get outsized rewarded. That no longer occurs. So now it's about making that trade-off internally for like, how can I get, I would absolutely trade off a more predictable 8% than a less predictable 10% that could end up being 7.
Yes.
So I want to go for the more sure thing. And probably the other thing that I would sort of lay into that is sheer impact. So let's say that I could get super fast impact and 70% savings, but let's say that it impacts my calendaring system.
Right.
I might be like, who cares? But if you're like, oh yeah, by the way, I can save you 20% on your AWS spend, you've got my full attention because that's my largest cost.
Right.
Or next to my largest cost, or it's Azure or whomever.
Because every service has a different type of pricing. There's a million different types of storage options that exist for cloud. Some of them are 10 megs or 100 megs or 1 gig or 5 gigs, 2 gigs, 3 gigs. 3.5 gigs, but only under these circumstances on alternate Wednesdays. Like, it's such, so much detail to what's going on there. Or you'll have certain things that are, 1 million calls for $10, and then the next million calls are $20. So many tiers and bits and bytes that are going on that it really does require some level of technical understanding of cloud services to simply to understand what one Apple is, much less do an apples to apples comparison across either vendors or cloud versus on-prem. Obviously, you can't go to that extreme, but what I do tend to see is, so I mentioned that rule of 30, which is is not just a matter of I'm going to tweak 1 or 2 things. That takes a concentrated effort. And then I see other companies that even talk about 70 to 80% savings, and often they are replacing legacy technologies with a brand new approach.
When you say 70%, I'm interested. I'm absolutely interested in that. And so then the question is like, well, what does it take to realize that? And is that 70%, starts at 70%, but then it sort of begins to compress because, oh, we've got to go invest into this, or we've got to go hire this set of folks to do that, who need to learn how to do that. And so often what I hear, at least from what my experience has been, we have to re-architect. We have to redo how we've been doing things in the past. And often that's where you have to get a little bit of bring everyone together, because this may mean that operations actually has to do things differently to take advantage of the savings, to take advantage of the speed, speed to market, whatever the case may be. So often you have to get a little bit outside of like what's in it for me and what's best for the organization. And so that's where there's a little bit of like, how do you get the CFO on board? But how do you get him or her on board when you're educating something probably fairly complex? Like you start talking about relational databases, their eyes glaze over. They're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. All I heard was 70% savings. So get me that. And so like, no, but you have to understand what's entailed to do that. And so that's where there's a bit of an education. You have to bring along, those who may not be technically inclined. If you're only incrementing by 5%, because you better believe that someone else is going to come along who doesn't have the legacy infrastructure to build, because they've never built it yet. They're going to come use the latest and greatest, and they're free to go do that. So that's what I try to remind everyone on my teams, that someone's always coming after our lunch. So you better be looking at what the next best thing is, because otherwise we're going to get stuck.
Adriel, as a CFO, how do you encourage exactly that? How do you have the discussion with engineering and IT and say, I want to open up, I want to think differently, I want to consider how we optimize this architecture, do we need to add a new one, how do we make that transition, and how do we manage through that uncertainty?
Well, the good news is like now is the perfect time because CFOs have never had more of a rationale, both from their board, their investors, their CEOs. CEOs are coming to me and they're asking like, hey, what do we do?
Yeah.
And so, for many of the folks, whether they're operational leaders or VPs of engineering, it's not like it's a surprise.
Right.
They're hearing it. They're seeing the papers or the virtual papers.
Yeah, I recently had a conversation with a colleague around technical debt. And my colleague argued that technical debt is just a buzzword and it doesn't exist. But I actually think that the concept of technical debt is important because in the financial world, if you're talking about financial debt, debt has a very specific definition, right? You are borrowing money and then there's an interest rate involved, there's a commitment involved. If you default on debt, that is a big deal. And I think we should take technical debt more seriously and perhaps use that more technical definition that if you're using outdated technology, there is a literal debt involved that you have to pay for. It's going to cost more in terms of the money that you're going to spend going forward. You're going to have to spend more on labor. Like there's an actual aspect of debt involved in technical debt. It's not just something.
Amen to all of that.
Thank you both for joining us for this Tiki Talk. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Cheers.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Cheers.